December 8th, 1967. Edwards Air Force Base, California. The desert sun was already low when Major Robert Lawrence climbed into the back seat of the F-104 Starfighter. At 32 years old, he was 6 months into the job he'd trained his entire life for. The first African-American astronaut in American history. Today, he was teaching another pilot the landing technique that would one day bring spacecraft home from orbit. The maneuver he'd helped pioneer himself, a technique NASA would later credit as critical to the Space Shuttle program. In 10 minutes, he would be dead, and for the next 30 years, the United States government would pretend he had never been an astronaut at all. This is the story of how America's space program erased its first black astronaut from history, how his widow received hate mail celebrating his death, how his name was deliberately excluded from the memorial honoring fallen astronauts, and how it took 3 decades of fighting to force NASA to admit what they'd tried to bury. October 2nd, 1935. Chicago's South Side. Robert Henry Lawrence Jr. was born into a world that had very specific ideas about what black children could become. His parents divorced when he was a toddler. He and his older sister Barbara lived with their mother Gwendolyn in the Good Neighbor apartments. They didn't have much. Every Christmas, young Robert asked for the same thing, a chemistry set. Each year, a more elaborate one. His mother saved to buy him a piano, hoping he might become a musician. It came with 8 free lessons. Robert took the lessons, he practiced. But when he looked up at night, he wasn't thinking about music. He was thinking about the stars. His father would later tell reporters that Robert was scholarly and serious, disciplined in a way that seemed beyond his years. At Haynes Elementary School, teachers noticed something unusual. The boy didn't just complete his assignments. He devoured them, pushed for more, asked questions that forced them to crack open reference books. By the time he reached Englewood High School, Robert Lawrence had a reputation. The kid who turned math problems into personal challenges, who treated science classes like treasure hunts, who built model airplanes with an engineer's precision, studying lift and drag before he knew what the words meant. He graduated in the top 10% of his class. At 16 years old, most teenagers celebrate finishing high school with parties and summer jobs. Robert Lawrence enrolled at Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois, chose chemistry as his major because he wanted to understand how the universe worked at its most fundamental level. But chemistry wasn't enough. While studying molecular structures and chemical reactions, he joined the Air Force Reserve Officers Training Corps. If he was going to understand the sky, he might as well learn to fly in it. At Bradley, he became a member of Omega Psi Phi fraternity, rose through ROTC ranks with the same methodical excellence he applied to everything else. By the time he graduated in 1956, he'd earned his Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry. At age 20, and he'd been named Cadet Commander, the second highest ranking cadet at the school. The commission came with the degree. Second Lieutenant Robert H. Lawrence, Jr., United States Air Force Reserve. He reported to Malden Air Force Base in Missouri for flight training. The instructors there had trained thousands of pilots. They'd seen confident kids, talented kids, kids who thought they were going to be the next Chuck Yeager. Robert Lawrence was different. He didn't swagger. He calculated. Studied every maneuver until he could explain the physics behind it, practiced until his hands knew what to do before his brain finished thinking it. At 21 years old, he was designated a United States Air Force pilot. A year later, he married Barbara Kress, daughter of Dr. Henry Kress, from one of Chicago's prominent black families. The wedding was the kind of event that made the society pages. 2 young people with bright futures ahead of them. They had a son, Tracy. And Robert's career accelerated. By 25, he was an instructor pilot for the German Air Force, teaching in West Germany, flying T-33 training aircraft, accruing hours and expertise. But Lawrence had bigger plans. He returned to the United States and enrolled at the Air Force Institute of Technology at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, while maintaining his flight status, while being a husband and father. He began work on his doctorate. In 1965, at age 30, Dr. Robert H. Lawrence, Jr. defended his dissertation at Ohio State University. The title alone was enough to make most people's eyes glaze over. The mechanism of the tritium beta ray-induced exchange. Reactions of deuterium with methane and ethane in the gas phase. Complex chemistry. Graduate-level physics. The kind of work that required years of study and a mind that could hold multiple abstract concepts simultaneously. But it was the dedication that revealed who Robert Lawrence really was. He wrote, "This work is dedicated to those American Negroes who have spent their lives in the performance of menial tasks, struggling to overcome both natural and man-made problems of survival. To such men and women, scientific investigation would seem a grand abstraction. However, it has been their endeavors which have supplied both the wherewithal and motivation that initiated and helped sustain this effort." He understood exactly what he was doing. Every achievement wasn't just personal success, it was proof of what was possible, evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. By 1967, Major Robert Lawrence had logged over 2,500 flight hours, 2,000 of them in jets. He'd been flying the F-104 Starfighter at Edwards Air Force Base in California, one of the most dangerous aircraft ever built, so unforgiving that pilots called it the missile with a man in it. Lawrence was using it to test landing techniques for spacecraft returning from orbit, the X-15 rocket plane, the lifting bodies, the future Space Shuttle. All of them would need to land unpowered, falling out of the sky at hundreds of miles per hour, making a controlled crash. Lawrence was figuring out how to survive that crash. The technique was called flaring, coming in at a 25-degree dive, 330 miles per hour, thrust at idle, landing gear, flaps, and speed brakes fully extended. Then, at the last second, pulling the nose up sharply, using the aircraft's momentum to generate one final burst of lift, bleeding off speed, touching down soft enough to survive. The timing had to be perfect. Too soon and you'd stall, fall out of the sky again, hit even harder. Too late and you'd hit the runway at full speed. Either way, you died. Lawrence had mastered it. NASA would later say his work contributed greatly to the development of the Space Shuttle. But in June 1967, Lawrence's work on landing techniques wasn't his only achievement. The United States Air Force held a press conference. 4 pilots stood at the front of the room. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Harris, Major James Abrahamson, Major Donald Peterson, and Major Robert H. Lawrence, Jr. They'd just graduated from test pilot school. Now they were being assigned to something new, the Manned Orbiting Laboratory Program, MOL, a classified military space station project. 2-man crews would spend 30 days in orbit, visual reconnaissance, communications intercepts, military applications of space technology. The Air Force's answer to NASA's civilian program. The 4 men were becoming astronauts, and Major Robert H. Lawrence, Jr. was the first African-American ever selected for any national space program. A reporter asked the question everyone was thinking. "Will you have to sit in the back seat of the capsule?" The reference was obvious. Just 3 years earlier, the Civil Rights Act had banned racial discrimination in hiring. Jim Crow laws were still being challenged across the South. The question was meant to be funny. The MOL astronauts laughed, but it wasn't really funny. Another reporter asked Lawrence if his selection was historic for race relations. Lawrence gave the answer he'd probably prepared. "No, I don't think so. It's another one of those things that we look forward to in civil rights. Normal progression." He paused. "Perhaps I have been more fortunate than the others in the opportunities." His fellow selectee Donald Peterson, a white Southerner, added his own statement. "I can't speak for all the people in Mississippi, but I'm not reluctant to work with a black man." It was 1967. These statements were necessary. Robert Lawrence was 31 years old. He'd earned degrees in chemistry and physical chemistry. He'd trained pilots. He'd pioneered landing techniques. He'd been selected from hundreds of applicants because he was, in the words of his commanding officer, the best qualified of any of the men for astronaut. Duties. The only selectee with a doctorate. And he'd done it all while being black in America. 6 months later, Lawrence was still at Edwards, still flying the F-104, still perfecting techniques for bringing spacecraft home. December 8th started like any other training day. Major Harvey Royer was operations chief at the Aerospace Research Pilot School. Experienced pilot. Competent. But he was learning the flare maneuver. Lawrence was in the back seat as instructor. The weather was perfect. 50 degrees, 8 miles per hour wind, 20 miles visibility. They took off in the afternoon, climbed to 25,000 feet, started running approaches. The first few went fine. Come screaming down at the runway. Idle power. Everything extended to create maximum drag. Make the F-104 fly like it was fighting through molasses. Then, at the last moment, nose up, bleed speed, touchdown. They did it again and again. On one approach, something went wrong. The accident report is clinical. The aircraft contacted the runway left of centerline, approximately 2,200 feet from the approach end. Royer had flared too late, or maybe too early. The timing was off. The F-104 hit hard. Both main landing gears collapsed instantly. The canopy shattered. The plane dragged along the runway on its belly for 214 feet. Sparks. Metal screaming. The underside caught fire. Then the aircraft bounced, briefly airborne again, came down at the 4,000-foot mark, veered left, departed the runway at 4,235 feet. Major Harvey Royer ejected upward. The front seat shot straight up. His injuries were severe, but survivable. The back seat had a timing delay. Critical safety feature. Wait a moment so you don't collide with the front seat during ejection. Lawrence's seat delayed. In that half-second, the F-104 rolled onto its side. When Major Robert Lawrence's ejection seat fired, it didn't go up. It went sideways, straight into the ground. He was still strapped to the seat when it hit. His parachute never had time to open. The seat and Lawrence's body were dragged 75 feet from the burning wreckage. He died instantly. Age 32. Married. Father of an 8-year-old son. The only selectee from his MOL class with a doctorate. The first African-American astronaut. 6 months after his selection. He never made it to space. They buried him in Chicago with full military honors. 8 of his fellow MOL astronauts attended. Mayor Richard Daley ordered flags on public buildings lowered to half-staff. His wife Barbara, his son Tracy, his mother Gwendolyn, and his sister Barbara sat in the front pew at the First Unitarian Church. The chapel was full. Later, they would dedicate Robert Lawrence Lane at 22nd and State Streets. A neighborhood club called the Young Men of Pride helped get the sign erected. Tracy Lawrence, 9 years old, stood next to his mother for the dedication. And then Barbara Lawrence started receiving mail. Not all of it was sympathy. Years later, she would tell an interviewer about one's letter she remembered, mixed in with the condolence cards. An envelope. She opened it. Inside was a note. The writer said they were glad Robert was dead, that now there would be no on the moon. There were others, letters celebrating his death, hoping it hurt, expressing satisfaction that the space program would stay white. Barbara Lawrence, grieving, had to open each piece of mail, not knowing if it would offer comfort or hatred. In June 1969, a year and a half after Lawrence's death, President Nixon cancelled the manned orbiting laboratory program. Budget cuts. The project was deemed too expensive. Spy satellites were getting better. NASA's Skylab space station was in development. MOL was redundant. The Air Force transferred 7 of the younger MOL astronauts to NASA: Carol Bobko, Robert Crippen, Gordon Fullerton, Henry Hartsfield, Robert Overmyer, Donald Peterson, Richard Truly. All of them were under 35 years old. Robert Lawrence had been 32 when he died. He would have qualified for the transfer. All 7 of those transferred astronauts flew on the Space Shuttle in the 1980s. Bob Crippen flew the very first shuttle mission, STS-1, in 1981. Dick Truly became NASA administrator. Every single one of them went to space. Major Robert Lawrence would have been among them, would have piloted one of those early shuttle missions. The landing techniques he helped develop. The flare maneuver that killed him. The shuttle would use that same approach. In 1971, Apollo 15 astronauts left a memorial plaque on the moon. 14 names. American and Soviet astronauts who died in the line of duty. Robert Lawrence was not included. In 1986, after the Challenger disaster killed 7 astronauts, a private foundation began planning a memorial. The Space Mirror Memorial at Kennedy Space Center. A 4-story granite monument with the names of all American astronauts who lost their lives in the space program. It was dedicated in 1991. 16 names were engraved on that polished black surface, names lit from behind so they glowed against the Florida sky. Robert Lawrence was not among them. The Astronaut's Memorial Foundation had a reason. The Air Force defined an astronaut as someone who had flown in space, at least 50 miles above the Earth's surface, and completed astronaut training. Lawrence had died during training. He'd never flown above 50 miles. Technically, by the Air Force's 1967 definition, he wasn't an astronaut. The Foundation pointed to regulations, to definitions, to technical specifications. Many people thought the real reason was different. Lawrence's family said it was racism. Historians said it was racism. The black community said it was racism. But the Space Mirror Memorial was dedicated without his name, and the Astronaut's Memorial Foundation moved on. Except one man didn't move on. James Oberg was a NASA Space Shuttle engineer, a historian. He'd served in the Air Force. In 1967, as a graduate student at Northwestern University on a NASA grant, he'd read the headlines. Crash kills Negro astronaut. He'd never met Robert Lawrence, but he knew the story. He knew what Lawrence had accomplished. In 1993, Oberg began writing letters to NASA, to the Astronaut's Memorial Foundation, to anyone who would listen. His argument was simple. Robert Lawrence had been selected as an astronaut by the United States Air Force. He'd been training for a space mission. When MO was cancelled, all the other astronauts transferred to NASA. Lawrence would have transferred too. He died in the line of duty as an astronaut. The 50-mile rule was arbitrary, a technicality, a way to exclude him. A 1989 Congressional Research Service report included Lawrence's biography in the astronauts section, listed him among astronauts who died in the line of duty. The Foundation rejected Oberg's petition. In 1996, he tried again, gathered more evidence, interviewed people who knew Lawrence, documented the transfer of MOL astronauts to NASA, showed how the definition had changed, how Lawrence would be considered an astronaut under current NASA standards. The Foundation rejected him again. But Oberg wasn't alone anymore. Barbara Lawrence was still fighting. Lawrence's son Tracy was fighting. His sister Barbara was fighting. The Omega Psi Phi fraternity was fighting. U.S. Representative Bobby Rush, Democrat from Illinois, got involved, started making calls, writing letters, putting pressure on NASA and the Air Force. The Clinton White House began asking questions. Barbara Lawrence told the Chicago Sun-Times, "At a certain level, it's very hard to deal with this. You know what he accomplished, and you know he's qualified. To have a bunch of people saying, 'No, he doesn't qualify,' that gets you angry." In January 1997, the Air Force officially recognized Robert H. Lawrence Jr. as an astronaut, 30 years after his death. The Astronaut's Memorial Foundation had no more excuses. In September 1997, the crew of the Space Shuttle Atlantis carried Lawrence's MOL mission patch into orbit during the STS-86 mission, a tribute to his outstanding accomplishments as an American space pioneer. The flown patch was presented to Barbara Lawrence. On December 8, 1997, exactly 30 years after the crash, Lawrence's name was engraved on the Space Mirror Memorial at Kennedy Space Center, the 17th name added to that monument. His sister, Dr. Barbara Lawrence, attended the ceremony. She spoke about growing up with Robert on Chicago's South Side, about how disciplined he was, how dedicated to learning. She said, "I'm truly proud to have been his sister. He wasn't interested in being the first black astronaut. He was only interested in being given the opportunity to do what he wanted to do. I'm sorry he wasn't here a little longer, but I think his job was one that was well done." Hundreds attended that ceremony. His fellow MOL astronauts, NASA officials, space pioneers, people who'd fought for 30 years to see his name on that wall. The ceremony was somber but spirited, a recognition of what had been stolen and partially returned. Former NASA Administrator Charles Bolden, himself one of the first African-American astronauts to fly in space, spoke. "He is one of the giants on whose shoulders I stand. He was the first, but definitely not the last. He was undeterred by segregation and discrimination that he would find at every turn." The memorial now stood complete. But the question remained, why had it taken 30 years? The Astronaut's Memorial Foundation president tried to smooth things over. said they were glad the situation was resolved, said no one deserved the honor more than Major Lawrence, didn't explain why they'd fought recognition for 3 decades, didn't acknowledge what Barbara Lawrence had said, what everyone knew, that the technical definitions were excuses, that Robert Lawrence was excluded because he was black, that the space program, so proud of its Mercury 7 and Apollo heroes, had tried to erase its first black astronaut. The honors continued slowly. In 1994, a Chicago public school was named after him, Robert H. Lawrence, Jr., Elementary School for Mathematics and Science. In 2017, on the 50th anniversary of his death, NASA held a large ceremony recognizing him. KSC Director Bob Cabana said, "Major Lawrence truly was a hero. He took that first step setting the stage for what was to come." In 2020, NASA named an asteroid after him, Robert Lawrence 92892, located in the main asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. The 13th Northrop Grumman Cygnus spacecraft, launched February 15, 2020, was named the SS Robert H. Lawrence in his honor. Bradley University, his alma mater, installed an art installation commemorating him in February 2025. But these honors came 50, 53, 58 years after his death. A man who accomplished more in 32 years than most people do in 80, who earned a doctorate while being a husband, father, and Air Force pilot, who pioneered techniques still used by NASA, who was selected as the best qualified candidate for the astronaut program, spent his entire life preparing for one mission, and never got to fly it. The broader context makes Lawrence's story even more painful. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy had pushed the Air Force to accept Ed Dwight, another black pilot, into astronaut training. Dwight completed the Aerospace Research Pilot School in 1963, was recommended by the Air Force for NASA's Astronaut Group 3, wasn't selected. 14 white men were chosen instead, including Buzz Aldrin and Michael Collins, who would fly to the moon. After Kennedy's assassination in November 1963, Dwight was reassigned from Edwards Air Force Base. He left the Air Force in 1966. His astronaut dreams over. NASA officials never explained why he wasn't selected, whether it was his qualifications or his race. Robert Lawrence became the first black astronaut in 1967, 4 years after Dwight was passed over. 6 months later, he was dead. It wouldn't be until 1978 that NASA selected black astronauts, and not until August 1983 that Gwion Bluford flew aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger, becoming the first African American in space. 16 years after Lawrence's selection, 22 years after Ed Dwight entered training, the Soviets, America's Cold War enemy, had launched the first black astronaut in 1980, Arnaldo Tamayo Mendez, a Cuban, 3 years before America put a black man in space. Soviet propaganda had a field day. The Americans talked about freedom and opportunity, but a communist country beat them to space with a black cosmonaut. The Russian media even said Ed Dwight was rejected for astronaut duty because he is a Negro. The irony was brutal. America was losing the space race in optics while winning it in technology. Today, at the United States Air Force Museum, you can find information about Robert Lawrence. At Kennedy Space Center, his name glows on the Space Mirror Memorial. At Bradley University, students walk past a memorial to their pioneering alumnus. In Chicago, children attend a school named after him. An asteroid bears his name. A spacecraft carried his name to the International Space Station. But for 30 years, America pretended he never existed. Pretended the first black man selected to be an astronaut wasn't really an astronaut. Used technical definitions and bureaucratic rules to exclude him from the memorial honoring his peers. His widow had to fight. His family had to fight. A NASA engineer who never met him had to spend years writing letters and gathering evidence to force recognition of basic historical fact. And even after his name was added, even after the ceremonies and the honors, the damage was done. An entire generation of black children who could have looked up at the stars and seen Major Robert Lawrence never knew his name. never knew that a black man had been selected to go to space in 1967, never knew that someone who looked like them had been chosen among the best of the best. The erasure was the point. Robert Lawrence couldn't be allowed to exist in the space program's history because his existence complicated the narrative. The Mercury 7 were heroes. The Apollo astronauts were pioneers, all white, all celebrated, all immortalized in books and movies and documentaries. Adding Robert Lawrence to that story meant acknowledging that the space program had failed to protect him, that he died mastering techniques for a program that was cancelled before he could fly, that his peers all went on to fly the shuttle while he lay in a Chicago cemetery, that the program excluded black pilots for 16 years after his death, that when they finally did select black astronauts, they had to pretend Lawrence never existed because acknowledging him meant acknowledging all of it. The technical definition was a weapon, the 50-mile rule, the distinction between astronaut and astronaut candidate, the bureaucratic barriers James Oberg had to overcome. All of it was designed to keep Lawrence's name off that wall, to keep his story out of the history books, to maintain the fiction that the space program's racial reckoning didn't begin until 1978. Major Robert H. Lawrence Jr. was born in Chicago in 1935, graduated high school at 16, earned his bachelor's degree at 20, earned his doctorate at 30, logged 2,500 flight hours, pioneered landing techniques for spacecraft, was selected as the best qualified candidate for the astronaut program, died doing the job he loved, and America tried to forget him. This story matters because Robert Lawrence matters, because his achievements matter, because the 3 decades of erasure matter, because Barbara Lawrence opening hate mail matters, because children who never learned his name matter, because every time we let history be rewritten to exclude uncomfortable truths, we lose something essential. Robert Lawrence earned his place in history. It took 30 years of fighting to give it to him, and even now, most Americans have never heard his name, never learned about the first black astronaut, never knew that the stars weren't always out of reach, that a kid from Chicago's South Side made it all the way to the edge of space, that he died 6 months before he could cross that edge, that his country tried to pretend he never existed. The Space Mirror Memorial at Kennedy Space Center glows at night. 17 names now, astronauts who gave their lives for the dream of space. The 17th name shouldn't have taken 30 years to add. Major Robert H. Lawrence Jr. The first, but not the last. He earned his place among the stars, even if America tried to deny him.